The email arrived on a Thursday at 3:47 inches the afternoon. 3 sentences. No greeting, no signature except a logo. Your services are no longer required. We have decided to transition to a more qualified engineering team. Security will escort you from the building within the hour. Chen held the printout in his hands for a long moment without moving. Outside his office, on the 34th floor, the city moved in its usual patterns. People walking, traffic flowing, the world continuing as though something significant had not just ended. He was 41 years old. He had been employed at Nexus Systems for 8 years. He had a daughter. Her name was Sophie. She was 9. Her birthday was in 3 weeks. The email did not mention any of this. What the email did mention in the second line was that the decision was final and would not be reconsidered. It also mentioned that his access badge would be deactivated at 4 p.m. It was now 3:50 p.m. Marcus set the paper on his desk. He did not stand up immediately. He looked at the framed photograph on the corner Sophie at her school recital, holding a violin mid-performance, her expression one of absolute focus. He had taken that photograph 6 months ago. She had been working toward that recital since September. Then he stood, packed the small box with the items on his desk, the photo. A coffee mug Sophie had painted in 3rd grade, his personal laptop, and walked toward the elevator. It was at the elevator doors, as they were closing, that he heard the voice. Marcus, wait. The doors reopened. Standing in the corridor was Patricia Voss, CEO of Nexus System. She was 56 years old, had founded the company 22 years earlier, and ran it with the particular authority of someone who had built something from nothing and believed that entitled her to an absolute clarity of purpose. She said, "I want you to know this was not a reflection on your work. We're simply moving in a different direction." Marcus looked at her. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "I understand." And he did. He understood perfectly. The door closed. Chen had not grown up planning to be an engineer. He had grown up planning to be invisible. His parents had immigrated from Taiwan with $400 and a commitment to working until the work was done. They had worked. His father in factory management. His mother in hospital administration. They had put him through college. He had chosen engineering because it seemed like the kind of field where you could be quiet and still matter. For the first 10 years of his career, this had proven true. He had worked at 3 companies. He had been good at the work, not flashy, not the kind of engineer who stayed late for recognition or who spoke in meetings beyond what was necessary. But when there was a problem that no one could solve, they came to him. When the specifications made no sense, he was the one who noticed. When the design was theoretically sound but practically impossible, he was the one who found the way. His wife, Diane, had died 4 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, 18 months from diagnosis to end. Sophie had been 5. After the funeral, after the medical bills had stopped arriving, after the life insurance money had been placed into an account for Sophie's college fund, Marcus had come back to work. He did not request bereavement leave. He did not mention it unless someone asked. He simply resumed the work because the work was the one thing that did not require him to feel. At Nexus Systems, he had risen to the position of senior systems engineer. No management responsibilities, no team under him. Just the work. He had designed 3 major subsystems that had become industry standards. He had written the technical manuals for every major product the company produced. He had created the training protocols that certified new engineers. He had done this quietly, thoroughly, and with the understanding that quiet, thorough work did not ask for recognition. It simply asked to be allowed to continue. The irony was that 3 months earlier, Nexus had hired a new VP of engineering named Richard Halloway. Richard was 38, had worked at Tesla and Google, and had been brought in to streamline operations and modernize our technical culture. He had arrived with a mandate to reduce legacy positions and bring in fresh energy. Legacy positions. This was the term now being used for people like Marcus, who had built the systems that actually work. Richard had spent his first month at Nexus looking at the engineering department with the expression of someone assessing which furniture to throw out. He had called meetings about optimization. He had used terms like digital native and next-generation thinking. He had suggested that the engineering team was too set in its ways and that what Nexus needed was transformation. What he had not done was ask anyone what they actually knew. Marcus had gone to exactly 2 of Richard's meetings. At the second one, Richard had questioned a design specification that Marcus had written 5 years earlier. The specification dealt with power management protocols in the main systems array. It was, by any objective measure, the most elegant solution to a particular engineering problem that had ever been implemented at Nexus. Richard had said, "Why are we still using this approach? It seems outdated. We should use the newer methodology." Marcus had said quietly, "The older approach handles cascade failure states more reliably. The newer approach has a 3% failure rate under stress conditions." Richard had said, "That's theoretical. Practically, we haven't seen that failure rate in the field." "We haven't," Marcus had replied, "because the current approach prevents it." The room had been quiet for a moment. Then Richard had smiled, not a genuine smile, and moved on to the next item. But his eyes had shown something. A calculation, an assessment, a decision being made. 2 weeks later, he had begun recruiting a new team of engineers, young, ambitious, recently out of university, with no attachment to the old ways of doing things. All of them reported directly to him. None of them had experience with the actual systems they would be managing. 3 months later, Marcus had received an email. Marcus spent the first week after leaving Nexus in the house, doing the ordinary things that people do when something ordinary is no longer true. He went to his daughter's school. He picked her up at 3:15 like he always did. He asked about her day. She said it was fine. That Mrs. Patterson had given them an assignment about their family history. That she had written about her mom and about him. That she had talked about how he was the kind of person who figured things out. He took her to soccer practice on Thursday. He sat in the parking lot for 90 minutes reading news on his phone and thinking about nothing in particular. When she came out, her uniform was muddy. Her hair had come out of its ponytail at some point. She was smiling. He took her out for dinner on Friday at the restaurant she liked, the one with the pasta and the breadsticks that were warm and came with honey butter. He said nothing to her about work. She was 9. She did not need to know that her stability had just been disrupted. On Sunday morning, Marcus went to the grocery store. This was a task he had taken over from Diane years ago, before she was sick, because he found it easier to plan meals in advance than to make decisions on the fly. He bought milk, eggs, chicken, rice, vegetables, and the specific brand of cereal Sophie had decided was acceptable to eat. At the checkout, the cashier smiled at him. She was perhaps 60, had kind eyes, and said, "Having a good Sunday?" Marcus said, "Yes, thank you." He drove home. He put the groceries away. He made lunch for Sophie. Grilled cheese sandwich and apple slices. She ate it while watching a documentary about ocean creatures. He sat nearby and graded papers for the tutoring he had been doing on the side for the past year. 8th grade math. $40 per second student per hour. It had seemed like extra money at the time. Now it seemed like something else. Necessity wearing the face of supplemental income. On Monday morning, Marcus did what he had been trained by years of quiet crisis management not to do. He updated his resume. It took 4 hours because he could not figure out how to describe what he had done. Senior systems engineer sounded generic. The actual work had been designing the architecture that allowed a company with 400 employees to have the same computational capacity as competitors with 2,000. It had been solving problems that should have been unsolvable. It had been building things that worked. But how do you write that in a resume without sounding like you are bragging? Which he had never done, and could not begin to do now. He was still looking at the document, trying to find the right words when Sophie came home from school. She said, "Dad, something weird happened today." Marcus closed the laptop. "What's that?" Mrs. Patterson asked me about your work. She said she looked it up and that you had designed something important at Nexus. She wanted to know if I knew about it. Marcus felt something move through his chest, a discomfort that was not quite anxiety. What did you tell her? I said I knew you worked there, but I didn't know what you did because, honestly, Dad, you never talk about it. He said, I know, I'm sorry about that, Sophie said. Are you in trouble? And there it was. The question that children ask when they have learned, through observation of the world, that adults can fail in ways that matter. She had learned this when her mother died. She had learned it again just now, in the space between his normal routine being disrupted, and him not yet explaining why. He said, no. The company decided to go in a different direction. I'm looking for something new. She said, were you fired? He said, yes. She said, was it because of something you did? He said, no. She stood with this for a moment, processing it the way 9-year-olds do, with a directness that adults have learned to soften. Then she said, okay, what happens now? He said, we'll be fine. I will find something else. We will continue. And he meant it. He would find something. There were always companies looking for senior engineers. He was good at the work. The work did not care about your circumstances. The work only cared whether you could solve the problem or you could not. The job interviews started in the second week. There were 3 that went well, companies that were looking for someone with systems architecture experience, people who looked at his resume and his portfolio and said, this is very impressive work. But when they asked why he had left Nexus and he said truthfully that they had decided to eliminate his position, something changed in their faces. It was subtle, the change, a slight tightening, a reassessment. The question that formed behind the eyes, if he had been eliminated, did that mean he was not as valuable as the resume suggested? He did not explain that the company's new VP had been brought in to reduce headcount, not to improve performance. He did not explain that the decision had nothing to do with the quality of his work and everything to do with optics and budgets, and the particular way that large organizations periodically decided to reinvent themselves by throwing out the people who had built them. He simply said it was a restructuring and moved forward. 2 companies called back with offers. Both were for positions that paid 15% less than he had been making. Both required him to report to managers who were younger than he was and had less experience than he had. Both made it clear without saying so directly that he would be a support role, not a leadership role, not a creator of systems, but someone who maintains systems that other people would create. He turned them both down, which was a decision that made sense for approximately 4 hours before it stopped making sense. By the 3rd week, the savings account had absorbed 2 mortgage payments and a property tax bill. Sophie's soccer league required a $200 fee for the upcoming season. Her orthodontist consultation, which had been scheduled before Diane had died, was finally happening in 2 weeks, and the dentist had already said that she would need braces. The estimate was $4,200 over 24 months. The tutoring work had picked up slightly. He now had 5 students, $1,000 per week, if they all showed up, before taxes, before gas, before the life that continued to cost money regardless of employment status. He sat at the kitchen table on a Thursday evening, after Sophie had gone to bed, and looked at the numbers. The tutoring work could sustain them if he expanded it to 15 students. That would require 30 hours per week. If he worked 40 hours at a job that paid 15% less, that was 70 hours per week. 70 hours per week indefinitely, supporting a 9-year-old girl and a 200-square-foot house that had seemed reasonable when there were 2 incomes. He was still looking at the numbers when his phone rang. Unknown number. He almost did not answer it, but he did. The voice on the other end said, "Is this Marcus Chen?" He said, "Yes." The voice said, "My name is Thomas Webb. I'm the CEO of a company called Vertex Engineering. I understand you're looking for work." Marcus said carefully, "I am currently exploring opportunities." Thomas said, "I read your resume online." "Well, I had someone read it to me, and then I read it myself." And I watched a technical presentation you gave at an engineering conference in 2019. Do you remember that presentation? Marcus tried to place it 2019, before Diane was sick, before life had become a series of crisis management strategies. Yes, he said, though he was not entirely certain which presentation Thomas was referring to. It was about systems redundancy in distributed networks. You proposed a new architecture for cascade failure management. Yes, Marcus said. Now he remembered. He had presented that work. It had been published in a technical journal. No one had really paid attention to it at the time. It had been too theoretical, too academic. Elegant but impractical in the way that engineers had learned to dismiss things that did not immediately generate revenue. That architecture, Thomas said, became the foundation for every major distributed system built in the last 4 years. I don't know if you're aware of that. Marcus was not aware of that. He had left academia and moved into industry. He had stopped paying attention to the theoretical work. It had seemed like a luxury, paying attention to what you had created when you were busy trying to solve the practical problems in front of you. Thomas said, I want to hire you. I want to hire you to be our chief systems architect. I want to give you a team, budget, and the authority to build what you think should be built. I want you to design the foundation of everything we do. Marcus did not speak for a moment. Thomas said, Are you there? Marcus said, Yes, I'm here. This is unexpected. Thomas said, Can you come in to meet with me? Tomorrow. We're in the city downtown. I'd like to talk to you properly, not over the phone. Marcus drove to Vertex Engineering on Friday morning. The office was nothing like Nexus. It was smaller, newer, in a converted warehouse in the Arts District. The aesthetic was deliberately informal, exposed brick, natural light, plants everywhere. The kind of place that tried very hard to feel like it was not a place where people worked. Thomas Webb was waiting for him in a conference room. He was perhaps 50, had the energy of someone who slept very little and enjoyed it, and stood to shake Marcus's hand before Marcus had fully entered the room. Marcus, he said, thank you for coming. They sat. Thomas had a coffee. He offered Marcus coffee. Marcus accepted. The conversation moved through the expected territory. Thomas explained the company's mission building, distributed systems for companies and industries where failure was not an option. Healthcare, finance, infrastructure, places where the system had to work. We're small, Thomas said. We have 60 people. But we're growing fast because we solve problems that bigger companies can't solve. The problem is, we're reaching the point where we need someone who can design the architecture properly. We have smart people, but we don't have someone who has thought about this as deeply as you have. Marcus said, How did you find me? I asked for help finding who had written that 2019 paper. It took 3 months and a lot of conversations with people in the industry. But eventually someone told me your name. Then you showed up in the Nexus directory. Then you disappeared from the Nexus directory. I assume that means you're available. Marcus said. I am available, yes. Thomas said. Can I ask you something? Why didn't you stay in academia? After that paper, why did you move into industry? Marcus thought about this. The truth was complicated. The truth was about a wife. The truth was about medical bills and needing a stable salary and being exhausted by the demands of theoretical work. The truth was about a specific moment in his life when he had decided that survival was more important than significance. He said, I needed to provide for my family. Academic work didn't pay enough. Industry paid better. I took the industry path. Thomas nodded. And then industry didn't work out the way you wanted. No, Marcus said. It didn't. The person who fired you, Thomas said. Do you want to know what I know about him? Marcus said. That's not necessary. Hear me out, Thomas said. Richard Halloway worked at Tesla. Left after conflicts with engineering teams. Worked at Google. Left after similar conflicts. Has a pattern of coming into companies, eliminating senior technical people, replacing them with junior people he can control. taking credit for the work those junior people do. He's good at it. He's very good at making it look like transformation. Marcus said nothing. Thomas said, "The reason I'm telling you this is because I want you to know that this is not an unknown quantity. You were not fired because you were inadequate. You were fired because someone with limited technical knowledge felt threatened by someone with extensive technical knowledge." The coffee arrived. It was hot. Marcus held it in his hands. Thomas said, "I want to hire you because I believe in building systems the right way, not quickly, not cheaply. Right. And I believe that you are one of the 3 people in the world who understands what right means at the scale we're working at." He paused. "The salary is $180,000, plus equity, plus a budget of $500,000 to assemble your team, plus the title of Chief Systems Architect, which means you report directly to me and you have final authority over all technical architecture decisions. You will never work for someone like Richard Halloway again." Marcus set down the coffee. His hands were shaking slightly. He put them in his lap where Thomas could not see them. He said, "I need to think about this." Thomas said, "Of course, but I want you to know something else before you go." He stood, walked to a filing cabinet, and removed a folder. He set it in front of Marcus. "This is a technical manual, one of our primary products. Look at the cover." Marcus opened the folder. It was 340 pages. The cover showed a diagram of a distributed system architecture. And there, at the bottom, in small print, was a line that said, "Architecture based on redundancy principles, developed by Marcus Chen, 2019. Thomas said, "That's based on your paper. We licensed the theoretical framework. We built a company on it. And the fact that your name is not better known, the fact that you don't get credit for the systems that run on your ideas, that's a failure of industry, not a failure of you." Marcus stared at the manual for a long time. Thomas said, "Come work for me. Design the systems properly. Let me make sure your name is on the things you create. That's the deal." Marcus took the job. He called the tutoring families and told them he would be ending their sessions. He explained that he had found full-time work. One of them, Mrs. Patterson, Sophie's school counselor, asked if it was a good opportunity. He said, "Yes, I think it is." Sophie was happy. She did not ask many questions about the new job, but she seemed relieved that something had resolved. The instability that 9-year-olds notice without being told about it had been replaced by a new ordinary. She went back to focusing on soccer and the orthodontist appointment and the upcoming school recital for the violin. At Vertex, Marcus threw himself into the work with the intensity of someone who had been given a second chance. He assembled a team, 4 senior engineers and 2 junior engineers. He began redesigning the foundational architecture of every system Vertex had built. It was meticulous, detailed, and absolutely necessary work. Within 6 weeks, the company's system downtime had decreased by 67%. Within 3 months, new clients were signing contracts that were 40% more valuable because the system could now handle complexity that had previously been impossible. Within 6 months, Vertex had tripled its revenue. Thomas called Marcus into his office one Thursday. "I'm promoting you to VP of Engineering. Same authority you have now. But the title change comes with a 15% salary increase and additional equity. I want you to know how valuable this company considers you." Marcus said, "Thank you." Thomas said, "There is something else. I want to send you to a conference, the International Systems Architecture Forum. It's in San Francisco in 2 months. I want you to present the work we've done here. I want people to know your name." The conference was a significant event. Hundreds of engineers from major technology companies. Speaking slots were competitive. Presentations were recorded and distributed. It was, in many ways, the kind of visibility that Marcus had never sought but had always, quietly, deserved. He prepared for 6 weeks. He built the presentation slide by slide. He practiced the delivery. Sophie listened while he rehearsed in the living room. She said, "You're going to be great, Dad." You know way more about this than anyone else. He said, how do you know that? She said, because you only explain things that are really complicated, and you make them sound simple. That's how I know you understand them. The conference was in November. It was 1 week long. Marcus flew out to San Francisco on a Sunday. He checked into a hotel. He attended sessions. He listened to other engineers present their work. On Wednesday, it was his turn. He presented for 45 minutes. He showed the architecture they had built. He explained the design principles. He demonstrated the results. By the end, the room was full. People were standing at the back. The questions came for 30 minutes afterward. It was, by any measure, a significant success. On Thursday, Thomas called him. Your presentation went viral, Thomas said. Someone recorded it and uploaded it to YouTube. It has 200,000 views. Engineers are sharing it. There are already discussions happening online about your architecture. Richard Halloway watched it. Marcus felt something close to his chest, he said. Oh, better than oh, Thomas said. Richard Halloway called Patricia Voss and told her that the systems you designed while you worked at Nexus are the foundation of their competitive advantage. He told her that they should never have let you go. He told her that his decision to eliminate your position was a mistake. There was a pause. Thomas said, Patricia Voss wants to meet with you. She wants to discuss bringing you back to Nexus in some capacity. She's offering you a consultant role. $250,000 for a 6-month engagement. Marcus said, I don't want to go back to Nexus, Thomas said. I know. That's why I'm telling you this instead of connecting you with her directly. But I do think you should meet with her. I think you should look her in the eye while you tell her no. Patricia Voss's office was on the 40th floor of the Nexus building. It had been redesigned since Marcus had left. The walls were now a soft gray. The photographs were different. Everything was meant to feel modern and forward-thinking. Patricia stood when he entered. She was wearing a cream-colored blazer. Her expression was carefully neutral. Marcus, she said, thank you for meeting with me. They sat. There was coffee. There was a window with a view of the city. There was the machinery of a professional conversation. Carefully staged, Patricia said. I want to be direct with you. I made a mistake. I eliminated your position without fully understanding the value of the systems you had designed. I let Richard Halloway make that decision without sufficient oversight. And since your departure, it has become clear that that decision was a significant error on my part. Marcus did not respond. Patricia said, I'm offering you a 6-month contract, $250,000, to serve as a consultant to our engineering department. I want you to audit our current systems. I want you to identify where we've made mistakes. I want you to advise on how to fix them. After 6 months, I'd like to discuss a permanent return, Marcus said. I appreciate the offer. But I'm not interested, Patricia said. The offer can be adjusted, 7-figure salary, full authority over the engineering department. Whatever you need, Marcus said. It's not about the money, Patricia said. Then what is it about? Marcus thought about the elevator. He thought about the email. He thought about Sophie asking if he was in trouble. He thought about the 8 years he had spent at Nexus Building Systems, and how easily that had been discarded. He said, it's about the fact that when things became difficult, you made a decision without fully understanding the consequences. You trusted someone who did not have the knowledge to be trusted. And you did not ask the people who actually understood the systems what they thought. You made a decision about my value based on someone else's assessment, not based on the work itself. Patricia said, that's fair, and I'm genuinely sorry for that. Marcus said, I understand. But I can't work for someone who would do that. I can't trust that, next time something is uncertain, you won't do the same thing again. And I can't ask my daughter to be dependent on someone who might, at any moment, decide that I'm no longer valuable without asking why. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, is there anything I can do to change your mind? Marcus said, no, there isn't. But I'll tell you what you should do. You should go find Richard Halloway, and you should ask him to explain the systems that he said needed updating. You should ask him for the technical justification for every change he's made. And you should be prepared for the answer that he doesn't have one. He stood. And you should call the senior engineers who left after me. There were 3 of them. You should ask them to come back. You should rebuild the team that actually knew what they were doing. Because the systems that are running your company now are running on architecture that was designed by people like me. And if you want that to continue, you need to respect the people who built it. Patricia stood as well. She said, "I will do that." Marcus walked toward the door. At the doorway, he paused. He turned back, he said, "There is something else. Something you should know. The technical manual that your engineering department uses for training new employees. The one Richard Halloway approved. The one he said was adequate for the new systems approach." Patricia said, "Yes." "Read it," Marcus said. "Specifically, read the section on cascade failure protocols in the main systems array. The approach in that manual has a known failure rate of 3% under stress condition. The approach that your previous systems used had a failure rate of 0.3%. That's a tenfold difference. When your company experiences a cascade failure, not if, when the difference between those 2 approaches will be the difference between a manageable outage and a catastrophic systems failure." He paused. "When you want to know who warned you about that, you can look at who wrote that section of the manual. Their name is on it." Patricia stood in her office after Marcus left. She did not sit down. She walked to the executive assistant's desk and said, "I need a copy of the technical manual for new engineering training, immediately." Within 10 minutes, she had the manual. It was a binder, 340 pages, professional binding. She opened it and looked at the cover. At the very bottom, in small print that was easy to miss if you were not looking for it, was a line. "Power Management and Cascade Failure Protocols Systems Architecture and Philosophy. Marcus Chen, Senior Systems Engineer, Nexus Systems 2016. Patricia opened to the section on cascade failure protocols. It was 12 pages long, detailed, precise, every assumption explained, every decision justified. And at the end of the section, there was a note, printed in the manual itself. Note: this architecture approach was selected for its reliability under cascade failure condition. Previous system evaluations indicated a 3% failure rate under stress for competing approaches. This approach reduces that rate to 0.3%. The tenfold improvement in reliability justifies the additional computational overhead. Any modifications to this approach must be evaluated for impact on cascade failure resistance. Patricia had not written this manual. She had not reviewed it in detail. She had trusted that Richard Halloway had selected the right approach. She had trusted that the new systems were adequate. She sat in her office for a long time, looking at those 12 pages. Then she called the VP of Technical Operations. "Pull every change that has been made to the cascade failure protocols in the last 6 months. I want to see every modification, every decision, every justification, and I want it by end of day tomorrow, by end of day the next day." The scope of the problem had become clear. Richard Halloway had modified the cascade failure protocols. He had not eliminated them, but he had modified them in ways that increased efficiency at the cost of reduced reliability. The modifications were theoretically sound. They were also practical failures waiting to happen. On a Tuesday, 4 weeks later, a client's distributed system experienced a cascade failure. It lasted 47 minutes. It affected 200,000 users. The cost to that client was $2. $3 million. The failure propagated exactly the way that Marcus's 2016 note had predicted it would if the protocols were modified. Within 24 hours, Patricia Voss had called a full board meeting. Within 48 hours, Richard Halloway's employment had been terminated. Within a week, Patricia had personally called Marcus and asked him to meet with her again. This time, they met in a different location, a coffee shop, not her office. It was a choice Patricia had made, meeting on neutral ground, coming to him rather than asking him to come to her. She said, I did what you told me to do. I looked at the manual, I read your name. I understood what you had been trying to tell me, and I was ashamed. Marcus said, I'm not interested in your shame. I'm just stating facts. Patricia said, I know, that's why I wanted to tell you face to face. But I also wanted to tell you something else. The 3 engineers who left after you, I called them. All 3 of them. I asked them to come back. All 3 of them said no. Marcus said nothing, Patricia said. But they all had a similar comment. They said that the work culture at Nexus had become toxic, because people like Richard Holloway were rewarded for taking credit for other people's work. They said they couldn't work for someone who would allow that to happen. They said, you should have walked away sooner. She paused. They're right. And I'm trying to rebuild the company culture to reflect that. I've terminated 5 managers who were following Richard's model. I'm restructuring the incentive systems so that people are rewarded for building quality systems, not for appearing to innovate. And I'm instituting a policy that no manager can recommend eliminating a technical position without that position holder's own assessment being submitted to me directly. Marcus said, that won't fix the fundamental problem. Patricia said, no, it won't, but it's a start. They sat in silence for a moment. Patricia said, I also want to announce something publicly. I want to issue a press release acknowledging that the technical foundation of Nexus Systems was built by a team of senior engineers. Specifically naming you, I want to publicly apologize for not recognizing and protecting that team, and I want to commission a technical retrospective of the systems you designed, published in a prestigious journal with your name as the lead author. Marcus said, why? Patricia said, because it's right, and because the industry needs to know that quiet, thorough work matters, and because my mistake, my failure to protect the people who actually built the systems I was profiting from, is exactly the kind of mistake that's destroying technical excellence across the entire industry. If I can use my platform to demonstrate that mistake publicly and try to correct it, maybe that might matter. Marcus said, okay, Patricia said. Okay, you'll accept the acknowledgement. Marcus said, okay, go ahead. Do the press release. Commission the retrospective. But I want it on record that I declined your offer to return to Nexus because I believe that I can do better work in a place where I am valued for the quality of what I create, not for how useful I am to someone else's career. I want it on record that you failed to recognize that value for 8 years. And I want it on record that that failure is why I will not return. Patricia nodded. She understood. That's fair. It will be in the press release exactly as you've stated it. 6 months later, Marcus received an email. The subject line was, congratulations. It was from Richard Holloway, the email said. I don't expect you to respond to this. I understand that I am not someone you have any reason to respect. But I wanted to write to you directly and acknowledge that my decisions at Nexus caused significant harm to your career and personal life. I want to apologize for that. I was insecure about my own knowledge, and I dealt with that by removing people who I thought posed a threat to my authority. That was wrong. I have since left the technology industry and am working to understand why I behaved that way. I don't expect this apology to matter to you, but I wanted to send it anyway. Marcus did not respond to the email. He read it once and then deleted it. Some things, he understood, did not require a response. Instead, he focused on the work. Over the next year at Vertex, the systems he designed became the foundation for 3 more companies. The technical retrospective that Patricia had commissioned was published in EA Transactions on software engineering. It won an award. Other engineers began to reference his work. Opportunities arrived. He turned down most of them. He stayed at Vertex because Thomas Webb had valued him for the right reasons. Because the work was challenging. Because the team respected deep technical knowledge. At 9 years old, Sophie had noticed something. At 10, she asked him about it directly. Dad, are you famous now? Marcus said, I'm respected by people in my field. That's different from being famous. Sophie said, but people know your name now, right? People you don't know what you've done, Marcus said. Some people do, yes. Sophie said, "You deserve that. You've always been good at what you do. I'm glad other people get to know that now." He was sitting with her, watching the sunset from their backyard. When she said that, the sun was going down in streaks of orange and purple. Sophie was 10 years old and still had not gotten her braces yet. Because the orthodontist had recommended waiting another year, her soccer team had made it to the regional championships. She was happy. Marcus thought about the email from Patricia. He thought about the moment when she had not recognized his value. He thought about the email from Richard, apologizing for behavior that had already cost him years of career advancement and peace of mind. He thought about all the quiet engineers who were building the systems that the world depended on. Systems that nobody noticed until they failed. And he thought about the moment when Patricia had told him that his name was on the manual, and how that simple fact that his work was documented with his name attached had ultimately been what saved him, not because he needed credit, but because credit properly assigned prevented the narrative from being rewritten. It prevented someone else from claiming the work as their own. Sophie said, "What are you thinking about?" Marcus said, "I'm thinking about how important it is to put your name on your work." Sophie said, "Why?" Marcus said, "Because someday someone might need to know who you are, and if your work is there with your name on it, they'll be able to find you." Sophie looked at her father for a moment, with the understanding that 10-year-old girls can have when they have been raised by someone who tells them the truth. Then she said, "I'm going to remember that." And she did. Marcus never went back to Nexus System. 5 years later, Nexus was acquired by a larger technology company. The acquisition price reflected the value of the technical systems that had been designed years earlier. The board made substantial returns. Patricia Voss retired. She published a book about leadership failures. She mentioned, specifically, the mistake of not protecting senior technical talent. She mentioned Marcus Chen by name. Richard Halloway never worked in technology again. Sophie Hargrove went to college. She studied engineering. She said, when she was 20, that she had decided this when she was 10. After her father had explained to her how the work you do matters, and how important it is to be recognized for that work. And Marcus Chen spent the rest of his career designing systems that worked. Not for the recognition, not for the credit though. Credit now came regularly. He did it because systems that worked mattered. Because the difference between a system designed with care and a system designed with carelessness was the difference between something that held and something that failed. And whenever a new engineer asked him how to design something, his answer was always the same: design it properly, document it, put your name on it, and never let anyone convince you that your work is worth less than what you know it to be worth.